Hi, my name's Hayley Noakes, and this online session is going to be about developing your critical thinking. I just want to start off with what actually is a critique. So a critique aims to subject everything to scrutiny. It is a serious examination and judgment of something. It attempts to expose and falsify ideas, and it reflects upon the constraints to which academics may succumb to in the process of constructing knowledge. So we're going to go into that a little bit more deeply to try and explore further what do your tutors mean when they say to you, we want you to think critically and show your critical thinking here. So the word critical has positive and negative meanings. We know what the word critical means in everyday life, but in academics it can mean something slightly different. So critical in academia describes your quizzical attitude when reading something or listening to a new idea. So it's about questioning rather than about saying, that's rubbish, I'm going to criticise it. Being critical means weighing up the arguments for and against a particular point, as well as being aware of your own bias. Okay, we're all biased, your academics are biased, everybody's biased, but we try our best not to be when engaging in academic research, so that then what we can do then is look at things objectively as best we can, and then assess how plausible is any explanation that we've got in front of us for why a certain phenomena is the way it is. So just take a look at this picture of a load of black and white dots, and hopefully at some point you'll be able to see what it actually is. Some of you may be able to view this quicker than others. What you need to be looking for is, in the middle of the screen there's what looks like a Dalmatian dog with his nose down snuffling in some leaves. You can see his collar and his ear and some outlines of his front legs and his back legs. I can show you here if I use my cursor. See his collar's here, he's got ears, his snout's down there, and this is one of his front legs and his underside here, and then we've got his back leg down here. So some of you may be able to see that quite quickly, others it may take just a few seconds. Some of you may have not been able to see it until I point it out for you. Some of you might even be struggling now, but I just want you to for a moment then just try now to remember what it was like when you first saw this picture and it was just a bunch of black and white dots. Just try and see that again, without being able to see the dog. Make the dog disappear essentially. And I think most of you will find that that's virtually impossible to do. You can't make the dog disappear once you've seen him. And this is just a little example, an illustration of once you have a set of ideas in your mind about how the way the world works, how something is related to your subject area, it's very hard to get out of that way of thinking and then suddenly step back and just see the bigger picture again and look objectively at this. And essentially what it is just a load of black dots. It's just some of them happen to be placed to look like a dog. So it's just an example to say that it's really hard when you're thinking about your subject area not to put your own opinions in there that are based on simple life experiences or anecdotal evidence. And when you're thinking critically, that's not enough. We have to have objective, falsifiable, rigorous research that supports what it is we're saying. So just have a look at this picture here, and look at this picture here. And so I ask my students when we do this in a classroom, so what do you think when you see these two pictures here? Is this one okay? What's he doing there? Is he a little child causing trouble? And usually that's what they say. They say this child is inappropriate for this child to have a gun at his age. He's young, but there's the potential that he could be sort of hunting with his dad or something. This one here, they're much more willing to accept that this child here clearly is going out hunting, and where it's okay for us to accept that. We don't know what the situation is, the context behind these pictures. This child here could be the young world champion shotgun shooting champion, and he's just practicing, and he's very well renowned in his area, and he's not causing any trouble at all. So we assume because he's wearing this little puffer jacket and he's a little boy dressed in Western clothes with a gun, he must be out for mischief. We assume this child here, just because he's dressed in native clothes, he must be out hunting. But actually, this child here is actually going into warfare at a very young age, and he killed 3 other tribes members that day. So again, this is another example of how our culture, every day, everything we've learned is all absorbed into us, that we have these preconceptions about how something should be, how we might interpret something. So you always must remember that whenever you're doing any of your reading, is that your own voice will be in there. And also remembering whenever you're reading anything that any of your academics will all have the same thing, and it's not necessarily has to be related to your huge world views about sort of young children and weapons, but it could be that they've spent 20 years with this theory that they think is a good idea. That often there are other explanations for what the data and the results that they've got from whatever experiment is, but they will write their paper explaining what good evidence this is for whatever theory it is they're interested in. It doesn't necessarily mean that their evidence proves that their theory is right, but they've interpreted that data that way because of their beliefs about how the world works. So, the barriers to critical thinking are going with one's initial reaction and opinion. So that's what you need to try and do there, is there, and think more objectively and outside the box, to use like a common phrase, is that the context and how your initial reaction is not always the best way to go. When you're writing your assignments and doing your own research projects, you need to be objective as you can. We understand that no one's ever going to be fully objective, but you need to do everything you can, which is why we have these scientific experiments and rules about rigorous testing and research methods that we use to try and help with that. So, other barriers to critical thinking are wanting to know what is right and wrong. So often before we come to university, there are answers, there are the right things to write down in your exams. But it isn't like that at university. There is no right and wrong. There are only lots of theories with differing levels of evidence to back up that is a good theory, that is a bad theory. And it changes over time as well. It wasn't so long ago that we all knew that the atom was the smallest item on Earth, and now we know that's completely not true anymore. So all we can really do is disprove things to be the case. In the sciences, certainly in the social sciences, again, we never have any level of absolutely yes, that's the way things are. All we can do is look for evidence to see whether there are any patterns to sort of people's behaviour. So you won't know what is right or wrong. What is academics really is all about arguing with one another. So your tutors will have the specific ideas and theories that they're experts in. They'll go to conferences, present their research ideas, and they'll spend all day arguing with one another about whether that is a plausible explanation for that phenomena, where's the evidence for it, can something else explain that in another way, and this is what drives research forward. If we all just said, yep, that's right, and never experimented or tested it again, then we'd still be back in the days where we thought the Earth was flat. So you get out of the mindset of thinking that you want to know what's right and what's wrong. It's not about that. You get the higher grades at university by, of course, understanding the subject area and the main ideas that are important in your subject area. But you get the high grades in your university degree by being able to analyse and judge in a scientific way whether something is plausible or not. So we often have a reluctance to criticise experts as well, because you might say to me, well, I just want to know what's right and wrong, because who am I to tell my tutor that their idea is not very plausible? Who am I to read these journal articles, these people who've been doing it for 20 years, and have an opinion about whether I think that they're right or not? And again, you need to move away from this idea that it is based on your general opinion. Your opinion doesn't really count for anything. Your informed opinion counts for a lot. So if you read somebody's journal article and you can say to me, I don't agree with that, and you can explain to me why don't you agree with it with more than, I just think it's rubbish, if you can tell me, well, what's wrong with it? Where does the evidence fall down? Where is another explanation that is better? That is what we want to see in your assignments. So the experts thrive on this constructive criticism, because essentially that's what drives it, makes their research better, that someone else will test those ideas and add more evidence to support their theories, or indeed we might decide that a different theory is the better way to go. So it's not about being right or wrong. And you will never be able to think critically around a subject area if you don't read deeply. Okay, surface knowledge and knowing just the basics is not going to be enough to be able to think critically. So it is hard work. You have to be able to understand and describe a subject area, but you also have to understand them deeply enough to be able to say, I can see how this idea relates to this idea. So you need to read enough around a subject area to get a wide enough view of, in any given topic, there are 3 or 4 main ideas. You know what those ideas are and what they're arguing. Therefore, you'll be able to critique them and say, well, I think this one actually is probably the most plausible explanation. If you only read surface knowledge, you only find yourself maybe reading about one different part of that idea, then you won't have anything to compare it to, you won't be able to go any further. So you must be persistent when you're thinking critically. So you need to consider an issue carefully and more than once. We'll talk about question banks in a bit, but this is a good way to do that. And this is where your mentoring groups and the study groups can come in very handy, because you often then get ideas and opinions from others that you may never have thought of before. But you should be looking at the evidence for a viewpoint. So what are they trying to sell me? They're always trying to sell you something. They're trying to sell you their idea that that is the right explanation and the way we should be doing things or explaining things. So you look for that point, because that way then you'll be able to go forward and say, well, okay, all of these people are arguing these different points. How do they relate together? What are the implications as well as a viewpoint? Is it realistic and is it rational, or is it based purely on the fact that they have this point of view, they have this hidden agenda, and that's what they're going for? I used an example in another online session where I was talking about breastfeeding, and that if you go to look at the research on the UK National Breastfeeding campaign website, you'll find lots of evidence on there that says that breastfeeding is by far the best way to support your child's growth throughout its first 6 months of its life. But of course they have a vested interest in wanting you to believe those things. And actually, if you look logically at all the evidence for it, that actually a child can be just as healthy using formula milk. So you need to think about what is the underlying rationale for sort of why it is that a tutor, an academic might be saying that about something. So I've already said as well, knowing facts and what is right is not what academics is about. It is all about not knowing and further exploration and deeper knowledge of your subject area and arguing with one another. And I think once you get that, you'll realise that actually what we mean when we say sort of be critical and there is no right or wrong answers. It's important to identify the strengths and satisfactory points and weaknesses, but you must not, as I said before, you must know why that is so. It's not enough to know that I don't think that idea is a very good idea. You must be able to explain why that is, and it may be that there are flaws in the methodology, that their sample size is quite small. It may be that you've simply read other research and decided that it seems like a more sensible explanation to you as to why something's happened. So you should be critical though when you're reading, writing and listening. So in your lectures, have that question bank, which I'll talk to you about in a minute, with you. So you're always questioning what it is that's going on. So prepare for critical reading. So skim the introduction. Always skim the introduction and conclusion first and read the conclusions. That helps clarify the rest of the reading. So if you understand what point they're trying to sell you first, it's much easier then to be able to go through and understand the rest of the work. But always asking yourself those questions of what is the underlying argument here in the viewpoint? Where are they coming from? What is their rationale? Are they feminists? Are they constructivists? Are they from a positivist background? So that will give you an idea about why it is they've chosen the methodology they have, why they've maybe explained their results in a certain way. Theory can help fill in the gaps, and often when we hear the word theory we think, oh god, theory, that's just going to be a really boring, difficult essay that I've got to write here. But all theory is a set of ideas to explain why something happens and predict outcomes in the future. So there's a phenomena that happens, I don't know what we might talk about, that all boys do better in school than girls when it's an all-boys school. So same-sex schools, boys do better than girls do. We might then decide to test some ideas as to why that might be the case. Maybe it's because boys aren't distracted by the girls. Maybe it's because boys are actually just cleverer than girls. So what we'll then do is to begin to try and test those with different experiments, or we might come up with sort of some, it doesn't have to be an experiment, it could be a case study or something like that. And eventually then when we've got enough of those things, we can begin to build a theory of evidence. So a theory that says, okay, we've got all this evidence and we can say now that generally we find that this is the case here. We're not saying that that's definitely always the case, but we're saying generally here this is the case. So it's a set of ideas that are explaining why something happens. Sometimes people come up with a theory first. Sometimes people say, I've got a theory as to why boys behave differently in schools. I think it's because of this. And then we'd need to then find, to make that theory stand up and stand the test of time, we'd then have to find lots of evidence to support that. So, and if that's the case, then we can say, okay, you've got a sound, solid theory here. You might take the theory of evolution. That's what we say. The theory of evolution, often people take that as absolute fact. The only reason that is because it is got so much evidence that sort of supports it, that often people see the theory of evolution is fact, but you'll never hear a scientist say that it is fact. They will always say it is just a very good theory, because in science we never prove things, we only ever disprove things. And even in any of your social science areas or your arts areas, it's the same thing. You don't try and prove anything. You simply either look for patterns, if you're coming from a more arts background, to explain why things happen. In the sciences, we tend to try and predict what's going to happen next as well. So you might think about this criteria of credibility here. So when you're looking at arguments to assess a source that you've come across, you want to look at the reputation of the people that have written that journal article and think, well, are they from an academic background? Are they working at a university? Because if they're not, that means that they don't have then the credibility necessarily, or the qualifications, and gone through the rigorous process of having their work peer reviewed as some other people have done. So then you need to think carefully about, well, is it just based on their opinion, in which case actually that doesn't have any evidence to support that. You might also think about the arguments that are in there. Are the arguments they're making plausible, and do the evidence that they're using support those arguments, or is it that there are other explanations but they're just using that particular argument because of the rationale or the viewpoint that they're coming from? Look at the validity of the work that you're reading as well. Is it valid for your argument, or is it just interesting in some way? Often we do a lot of reading around a subject area, and then actually if you can't make a point to say, this is important for you to know this piece of information in order to understand my argument. If you don't need to, then it's superfluous extra information. You don't need to put it in your assignment. If you put in lots of ideas in your assignment that aren't valid and relevant, then that way it can make your work seem confused. Expertise as well, thinking about, again, I said, the expertise and the reputation of the people that have written your work there. Are they experts in that area? So do their names keep cropping up again and again and again? You'll often find in any kind of research subject area that there'll be a few names that are publishing again and again and again and again in those areas, and that way then you can know that those people are experts in their subject area. So probably the things that those people are saying are based on solid, sound theories. You might find that people that aren't publishing that much in those areas are just beginning to sort of research the field, and they might not necessarily have as much expertise, therefore credibility, as those that have been doing it for much longer and have a bigger body of evidence to support their arguments. That's not to say that you shouldn't use people that have got research that they've done that's quite current, based on fringe ideas, might not have a lot of evidence to support it, but you need to treat it like that it doesn't have a lot of evidence to support it, but it is a potential interesting idea that you're interested in. But you wouldn't base a whole assignment based on those ideas. Your tutors are looking that, do you know the main solid ideas that have already got lots of evidence to support them in this subject area? Neutrality is important as well. So again, thinking about, where is this research coming from? Who commissioned this research? And one thing to be wary of is, when you're looking at expertise, is that if somebody has done a lot of research in a subject area, often you'll find that it's because they're so keen and they so believe their explanations for something that they might miss this fringe idea that says, actually, but my idea is just as plausible to explain this phenomena or your evidence as yours. It just happens to be that they're so big in their field and they've always done it and believed and interpreted things in the way they have, that they carry on doing that. So look for neutrality. And I know that you like to think that maybe your journal articles are very objective, and they'll tell you the truth, but actually they don't always do that. You can find a journal article that has an amazing title that sounds like they've found this amazing new evidence for why something happens, or for explaining something, and then when you read the article and look at the evidence more clearly, actually you find that actually the evidence isn't that good, that it was sort of like 60% versus 40%. So that's not a hugely, you can't make a huge sweeping conclusion based on those statistics. It's a piece of evidence that supports that idea, but we need a lot more than that to be able to make these huge sweeping statements. So sometimes the titles of your journal articles will make it sound like this is an amazing piece of research that has found out some amazing sort of conclusion, but actually when you read deeper into the article and look at sort of the stats, it isn't always the case. So here we are. This is just another piece of some explanation here as to the Raven acronym that I've just shown you, so I'll just give you a moment just to read that. Okay, you can always pause here if you feel like you want to go through that further. So here I just want to mention about question banks, and this is really important when you're listening or reading or writing. It will help you develop that critical thinking. I can't teach you how to be a critical thinker in just sort of 30 minutes, an hour or so, how long these sessions go on for. But what we can do is give you tips and help you to develop those critical thinking skills, and you'll never lose them throughout your life, and you probably think more critically than you think you do now. Have you ever read a newspaper or the Metro and questioned sort of, well, where did they get that statistic from, or not believed it when you've seen an advert for a beauty product that states that it's going to make you look 10 years younger, and then you look at the tiny little thing at the bottom that says like 61% of users agree, and actually you must say to yourself, well, that's not actually that very good, is it? It means nearly 50% say they don't think it's a very good idea. So you probably think critically more than you think to do, but it's about applying that to these complex areas, and sometimes that can seem like it might be more difficult. So build yourself a question bank, and there's a number of questions on here that might help you get started. They're just general questions that you can apply to any subject area, and the word why is always going to be the one that's at the top of the list. So why have they used that explanation? What does this really mean? Do the reasons support the argument? So does the evidence they've given us support their argument, or could there be another explanation? What are the alternatives here? Is this relevant to my current purpose? What is the author trying to sell me? Are any flaws in this? So just even reading through and having those questions there before you start reading a journal article, or have them beside you when you're at a lecture, can just help spark that little bit of extra deep critical thinking. So you begin to start taking ownership of your subject area, so that you really start to think about what you think about it and how your ideas can relate to other people's that have already written that subject, and rather than just simply sitting there and being taught and absorbing, this is what everyone else has said. Obviously you need to know what everyone else has said, but then when you start questioning what everyone else has said, you can then build up an idea of, well, where do I stand in terms of all these ideas? And eventually when you get to masters and PhD level, and if you want to be academics yourself, you'll be able to develop your own theories and your evidence. So critical writing is important to use your word count to assess the number of points that you might make in your assignment and define the scope of your research. So the next slide will show you what we mean by that when we're talking about sort of whether you're describing, explaining or critically evaluating something. So it's not simply enough at university to describe ideas or explain theories. You must evaluate them. I could get out a textbook on any of your subject areas and copy out lots of descriptions or put them in my own words and hand that in as an assignment. It wouldn't get a very good grade because I'm showing no evidence of independent thought or understanding of how those ideas relate together, or which one might be the most plausible explanation. So your essay instruction terms that tutors ask you to do usually sort of veer around the idea of critically evaluating. So they're asking you to weigh up the arguments for and against something. You should be assessing, it says all the evidence, obviously you can't assess all the evidence, but you can assess a range of evidence related to those different ideas with regard to that subject area. Decide which ideas, theories are preferable to you and criticise them in terms of impact or significance, and investigate the implications. So what are the implications of us deciding that, or you deciding that that theory is the best way to explain how something happens? Okay, so they are asking you to make a decision, but as you can see here, it isn't a decision based on anecdotal evidence. Say maybe if you're working in with young children, they're not asking you to say things about like, well, my child at home always does this. That is not evidence. That's just an anecdotal idea. That's one person. We can't make a sweeping statement based on that. You might be asked to assess something, so you're deciding the value or judge the measure of importance of something. So usually those kind of essays start with a statement where you're being asked to assess whether that statement is useful or not. Discuss is really about you're presenting and giving a judgment on the value of arguments for and against and considering all arguments. Now, discussion doesn't necessarily mean you only have a for and against, a black and white argument. It's rarely like that in academics. You rarely have something where one person says one thing and another person says the complete opposite. Usually, actually, a lot of academics, they agree on a couple of general principles, but then they disagree on sort of often the nitty-gritty and sort of how we might go forward with those ideas. So it's more thinking about alternatives rather than for and against. So this slide here shows you a description, an explanation and a critical analysis. So it's about attachment theory. So attachment theory states that children become attached to adults who remain as consistent caregivers for some months during the period from about 6 months to 2 years of age. So here we're just describing what attachment theory is. We go a bit further then in the next one, the green section. You can see that the first sentence is exactly the same, but then we go on to say, it is suggested that this is due to the trusting bond developed from the repeated interactions with certain individuals. So we've just picked one idea there that's tried to explain why this idea of attachment theory comes about. So attachment theory, somebody's noticed a phenomenon, children become attached to these adults. Why do children cry when you take them away from their parents? Why are they bothered? Why aren't they happy with any adult person taking care of them? Someone's come up with an explanation for that and said that there's a trusting bond that develops from repeated interactions with certain individuals. That's just one idea. There'll be lots of other ideas. So there, if we leave it there, we're not having any critical discussion because we're not considering any other ideas. The red section down the bottom again says the same thing as the blue and the green one. It's got this keyword in here that you should always be looking for and including your own assignments. However, so we know what comes after it then is going to be something that is in contradiction or another idea to what's been said before. So however, there are many cases of abused children who form strong attachments to their abusers despite being subjected to severe neglect, suggesting that there are problems with this theory of attachment. So you can see here that we're not saying that they're not completely disagreeing. They don't got a complete opposite. They're not saying, no, it's nothing to do with repeated interactions or trust. That's completely ridiculous, although there may well be people that say that. But what they're saying is that, well, but there are abused children that have repeated interactions that also form as attachment. So this idea up in the first idea here, where we're talking about trusting bonds, shouldn't be the case, really, should it? If we've got children that are abused, then they're unlikely to trust their abusers, but they can still often become attached to them. So that might suggest that there's something else going on here. So then you might then go and look and research further and find, well, are there other explanations to why this bond, this attachment develops? And you can see there from this example, I mean, this is obviously a very crude example, but how if you're being descriptive or having an explanation, or you're critically discussing, then your word count varies. So generally you're being asked to critically evaluate and discuss in most of your assignments. You can see that takes a lot bigger word count to be able to do that. So if you've got a certain word count, you know that you're only going to be able to fit a number of points in there, and if you try to fit 10 points into, say, a 2,000 word essay, you're really only going to leave yourself enough word count to be able to describe and explain. So you're only allowing yourself to ever get up into sort of the low 50s at best in your grades, because you're not going for a critical analysis and showing independent thinking. So this is an activity that I want you to do at home. You can just find an object. Any object will do anything. It can be a pen, it can be a little bit of potpourri, it can be a candle, it can be anything. But what we want you to do is do 3 things with that. I want you to look at that object and only describe it. So write down a description of it. And you might want to refer back to this slide beforehand here to think about, okay, what actually do we mean by that? And then once you've done that, I want you to then explain, as if you explained to somebody who'd never seen the object before, what actually is that object used for. Just explain it. And then after that point, I want you to think of 3 alternative uses for that object. So imagine you've never seen that object before. Again, what might you think that that object could be used for other than its general traditional alternative use? And then choose one of the alternative uses and explain why might that not be suitable, or why might it be suitable for that purpose. So you're looking at the fors and against of how plausible that use for that item actually is. So if I've got a candle here, I'll describe it. I'm saying it's a small object. It's got a piece of material running through it. It feels quite hard. So I'm just describing what it is. It is quite hard to often describe without explaining as well. But if I want to explain its use, I will say to someone, well, you have to light this material bit in the middle, and it gives us light and it gives us heat. And sometimes people use it for not decorative occasions. But then I might say, well, actually, okay, I'm going to use this candle rather than for sort of decorative occasions. I'm going to use it to toast marshmallows on. I could also possibly use it to maybe I could use it as a throw-in object. I'm going to use it to play catch with my children. So I might pick one of those alternative uses and I'll say, okay, I'm going to use this candle now to play catch with my children. Well, why might like it explain now why it might not be suitable. It is suitable for that purpose because it's small and I can fit it in my hand and I can throw it. It travels through the air quite easily. However, it might not be so good for that because it's not a round object. When it hits the floor, sort of bits of wax fall off of it, and it certainly wouldn't be a good idea to throw that across the room to my children when it had been lit already. It could cause quite serious damage. So it's just a bit of a fun way for you to really understand the difference between describing, explaining and critically discussing. Okay, so I'll leave that with you there. There'll be other activities and resources on this website for you to look at if you want to develop your critical thinking further.